computer. Hello, everybody out there who might be watching this on YouTube. We are just about to start our next adventure in Bible study, which is right here in Exodus chapters 1 through 12. And we will start with a quick review. You guys know how I love this little limerick thing, and I handed it out to the people who were at the gathering place. And I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second because it looks very odd for me, but I guess it was okay. You guys must have all been able to see it okay. So we'll share. And anyway, I handed it out. If you want a copy of it, just let me know and I will get a copy of it for you. But it's creation, right? Adam and Eve, fall, original sin, flood, Noah, nations, the Tower of Babel, when God confuses languages. And then we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who was Israel and who had the 12 sons, and Joseph. And Joseph is his 11th son, and he's the one who went to Egypt. And then we have redemption, where there's a famine all over the land, and Joseph's brothers are forced to come and ask him for food. And there's a little bit of trickery involved, but in the end, he reveals himself to his brothers and he invites them all down to Egypt. He tells them, go get my father and bring the rest of the family and all your herds. And so the brothers go home. They tell his father Jacob, or Israel, that they're going to move to Egypt. And they tell him about that Joseph's still alive. Jacob sacrifices to the one God, and then he moves his whole family down to Egypt. And when they get there, the Egyptians don't want them mixing in, and they especially do not want to be mixed in with the Egyptian population. So their sanctification, they're set apart from the Egyptians. Oh, 2 people are in the waiting room, so let me let them in. Let's see, who's in the waiting room? Christy Evans. All right, so should be able to get rid of that. All right, so sacrifice, then sanctification, the setting apart of all of Israel and his whole family from the Egyptians. And that was where we left off. They were all in Egypt. And so let's talk a little bit about Egypt and talk about what happens. What you'll notice in the footnotes of Jeff Cavan's notes within the Bible, that he talks a little bit about, when was the Exodus, and why am I choosing the date I am for the Exodus? And to me, it was just something where you really wanted to know a little bit more about it. So I thought I would explain a little bit about Egyptian pharaohs. The Egyptian pharaohs are defined by dynasties. A dynasty is when one particular family becomes the pharaoh, and then his son takes it over and his grandson takes it over. And as long as it stays within that family, it stays within the one particular dynasty. But then somebody else comes in, they usurp the power and they become the pharaoh. And so they become a new dynasty, a new family takes over. And as long as it stays in the family, it's another dynasty. So Abraham is who God goes out and originally calls back. He's going to be the start of the chosen people. And we know that that happened about 1900 BC. I think the date we gave was 1880 before Christ. And Abraham would have been going down into Egypt because remember, he came from Ur. He was going to stop in the promised land, but because of a famine, again, he had to go into Egypt. And when he did that, he would have been going into an Egypt that was ruled by an Egyptian pharaoh. And it would have been in dynasties 10 through 12. Isaac, his son, would have been a little bit later, sometime in the 1800s. He still would have, Egypt would be being ruled by Egyptian pharaohs. By the time that Jacob lives, he doesn't go to Egypt here until finally Joseph tells him to go to Egypt. But Jacob would have been in the time when the Pharaoh's power was usurped, but it was usurped by people from Canaan. And those share the same family tree as the Israelites do, right? The Canaanites, the Edomites. We talked about how different brothers throughout that time from Genesis and Noah down to the time of Joseph were going different ways, becoming different tribes, and how that came about. Well, these guys come down into Egypt and they actually take over the country and they become pharaohs, and they're called the Hyksos. And over in this picture on the side, you'll see Abishah, the Hyksos. That little drawing is a drawing of one of these foreigners down in Egypt. It's actually found in the tomb of one of the Egyptians. And so by the time of Jacob, it's foreigners who are ruling Egypt as pharaohs. And when Joseph comes in and becomes a part of the Egyptian aristocracy, basically, he becomes the second in command. The pharaoh that he is answering to is a foreign pharaoh. And so then we are going to see in the first chapter of Exodus that the Israelites are enslaved by the Egyptians, and then Moses is going to lead them out through the Exodus. And Jeff Cavins in his notes talks about why is it that I picked this date, 1450 BC, as when Moses led these people out of Egypt. And the reason he does that, he explains, is because if you add up the time in the Bible where they say how many years they were in Egypt and the building of something else, I forget what the number was. The time in Egypt was 380 years. There was the building of something else. You add up those numbers, you come up with 1450 BC. And that's the number he chooses for the Exodus. A lot of biblical scholars will choose a later date. They'll choose 1250 BC. And the reason that they do that, you noticed in your reading that there are a couple cities that are named. One of those cities happens to be Ramesses, that they helped build this, the Israelites helped build that city. Well, that city would not have been being built in 1450 BC, but it would have been built by 1250. And scholars also like to choose the later date because the foreign pharaohs were usurped by Egyptians again. And remember how Joseph says, when we're reading in Exodus, that the Pharaoh no longer knew who Joseph was. He had forgotten about Joseph coming and doing this whole grain deal during the famine. Well, that's because these foreign pharaohs their power was usurped by actual Egyptians again. And the actual Egyptian pharaohs did not like foreigners. And when they first took over, they were very strong. But as their dynasty went on, as son after son took over, they became weaker and weaker. And by 1250, it would have been a fairly weak dynasty, and it would have been more likely that a tribe of people like the Israelites could have escaped. And so that just kind of is to help you understand Jeff Cavan's footnotes if you happen to be reading them, and his introduction into Exodus. And it also helps you understand a little bit about the pharaohs and that trading off. You always think of the word pharaoh as though it's always held by an Egyptian, but it's not. And we're going to see that again after the Exodus, that another foreign power is going to come over and take over, being pharaohs. So the other thing that I wanted to explain before we just jump into Exodus is that Cavan's note right at the bottom of the first page of the first chapter of Exodus says that there are many traditions that contributed to the Pentateuch, to the first 5 books of the Bible. And remember, the Pentateuch is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are the first 5 books. And so what are these traditions? And I just think it kind of helps you to understand what you read in the Bible when you know that there are different traditions that make for some, I call it clunkiness, repetition, or differences in numbers, or maybe there's a story that's repeated, but it's not repeated exactly the same. And that happens when you read the Bible. We already saw it in our very first reading when we read about creation, right? There were 2 different stories of creation. And that's because the 2 stories came out of different traditions that contributed to the Bible. The oldest tradition they call the Yahwist tradition, because it uses the proper name of God, Yahweh, which is translated as Lord in your Bible. We talked about that last week, I think, wherever you see Lord in all capital letters, it means that the Hebrew word that they were translating was Yahweh. The next tradition is called the Elohist. It's a later tradition. It's not as old. And whenever they write in Hebrew the name of God, they use El or Elohim or Eloah to refer to him. And when you see it translated into English, they'll just call it God, or they'll call it Lord, but they will not call it Lord with all capital letters when it's translated. Then we have the tradition of the Deuteronomists. They're an even later tradition that occurs, and they will be making their contribution after the exile is over, or after Exodus is over. And then lastly, we've got the priestly contribution, which is even later than the Deuteronomists. Now, those traditions, the fact that people, as they are transcribing the Bible and reading the Bible and adding some more parts to it, it doesn't make the Old Testament a myth. It just allows the story to be told by various witnesses at various times. It always really ticks me off when I happen to read on the internet, I'm looking something up, and it'll say, the Old Testament is the myth that Jews believe to, and Christians. It's not a myth, it's a history. And these people lived during different parts of the history that make contributions to it. And God allows that, right? God allowed this to happen so that his story could be told the way that he wanted it to. He let the humans contribute their way, and then as long as it didn't interfere with his story of salvation. So now that you got that little bit of background, let's jump into Exodus. Chapter 1, there's tragedy in Egypt for Israel, for Jacob and all of his family. They had flourished in Goshen, right? Tons of children had been born to them. Their cattle, their flocks are flourishing. They're in this very fertile land. But we're told that Joseph is forgotten by the new Pharaoh. And that may well be because now we've switched from having foreign pharaohs back to having Egyptian pharaohs. And the Hebrews become slaves. This is kind of an interesting picture based on a mural in the tomb of one of the Egyptian in Thebes, one of the aristocracy that actually had a tomb, and it shows what it was like to make bricks in Egypt. And you can see right here down below, here's a guard watching with a whip as this guy's pouring out clay, and the carrying the bricks and what a heavy loads they're under. And here's another guy not working hard enough, so he's getting hit. It doesn't really look like a very pleasant experience. And as we read about it in Exodus, we know that it's not pleasant, that they are groaning under that kind of heavy labor. And the Egyptians are still worried about them. Even though they've become slaves, they're still a thriving community. They're having lots of children. And so the Pharaoh orders the Hebrew midwives to kill all the male babies. But the midwives won't. They fear God. They know that God made these children and that they are going to be punished if they start killing them. And so they say to Pharaoh, we can't kill them because the Egyptian women are so strong that the babies are already born by the time we get there. So then the Pharaoh tells just the people in general, when you see a male Hebrew baby, drown him in the river. And it's my own personal opinion. I suspect that many of them would not. You can remember in the Second World War that all Germans were ordered to report all Jewish people to them, but a lot of the Germans did not. They actually took Jewish people into their homes and hid them. They took Jewish babies into their home and adopted them and called them their own, right? So I suspect that although there would have been people who did it, there would have been some that would have refused. But it's a terrible tragedy that these people who had gone from being kind of spoiled foreigners in this foreign land now to being these brick makers where people are after their children. Well, Moses has a very special story. Number one, it tells us that Moses is descended from Levi. That's an important piece of information just because the Levites will become the priestly class. So this gives us a little bit of insight into Moses already has a kind of special connection with God. His mom floats him on the Nile. She takes a basket, she puts tar around it, waterproof, she puts the baby in it. And here's a great picture of the Pharaoh's daughter. She's ordered her slaves to take this basket out of the river that she spied. She sees and recognizes it's a Hebrew baby, and she decides to adopt it. So Moses grows up. He's raised as an Egyptian by the Pharaoh's daughter, but he figures out that he's a Hebrew. Hebrews didn't look like Egyptians. And he also was nursed by his own mother. Remember, after Pharaoh's daughter takes her, Miriam, Pharaoh's sister, comes out of the reeds and says, you know, do you want me to find someone to nurse that baby? And she takes Moses back to his mother. And so Moses probably had some limited interaction with the Hebrews. He figures out he is one. He sees an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrews, or he sees an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrew slaves. So he kills him and he buries him in the sand so that he won't get caught. But the next day he's out and he sees a couple more Hebrews fighting, and he goes to break it up. And one of them says to him, oh, Are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? And all of a sudden, Moses knows the story is up. He is not going to be able to stay in Egypt. Pharaoh finds out. Pharaoh wants him killed. So he flees to Midian. And if you happen to have looked in the back at your maps, the second map that's in there is a map of the wanderings when the Hebrews leave Egypt. And it will show in there where Midian is at. And in order to get to Midian, it's God always has a plan, right? In order to do that, Moses actually has to go out into the wilderness, the same wilderness into which he's going to lead all of Israel. So he'll get a little experience out there. And when he gets to Midian, it kind of reminds us of the stories of Rebecca and Rachel. He goes to an oasis. There are women who are daughters of somebody bringing down a flock. He pushes away the stone to give them some water. And then the girls go home and tell their dad. And their dad invites him in, to have a meal. And this shepherd, where Moses goes to his home, he is first called Ruel, and then he's called Jethro, and later in the Bible he'll be called Hobab. And that's not such an unusual thing. I mean, if you knew me throughout my life, you'd have known that, I was at first called Christine by my father. I was called Chris by friends. I wanted to be called Casey when I was in high school. I had friends in the Navy who called me Lou. I had other friends who called me Jamal. I had lots of names throughout life, and depending on which friends you talk to, you'll see these names. Same is true with characters in the Bible. They'll sometimes have many different names. Sometimes God changes their name. But Moses goes to Jethro. That's the name that he's usually called by. And Jethro gives him his daughter Zipporah to marry. So Moses is happy in Midian, right? He's given up all this other life. He's out with the sheep. He's being a shepherd, and he likes it. But back in Egypt, Israel is groaning, and it says that God remembers them. So Exodus chapter 3 is the calling of Moses. And we hear that he is out, and he actually would have been not in Midian when he is called. He would have taken the flocks kind of around a body of water and would have been in lower Saudi Arabia, if we use the current names. And Moses is out there with the sheep, and he looks on the side of this mountain, and he sees a bush that's burning, but it just keeps burning and burning and burning. It's not being consumed. And so it says in Exodus chapter 3 that an angel of the Lord calls him from this bush. And then it later identifies this angel of the Lord as God. And it says that this is happening on Mount Horeb. And although there's some debate as to whether Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai are the same place, most scholars will agree that they are just two different names for the same mountain. One of the church fathers used to say it was one mountain but had two peaks. One was called Horeb, one was called Sinai. So he goes over to look at it, and the bush yells out to him, "Moses, Moses." And Moses responds, "Here am I." And you'll hear that many times in the Bible when God calls somebody, they'll say, "Here I am." There is a great story also in the Eastern Rite of the Catholic Church. Oftentimes you'll see in icons, the burning bush will be a bush, and it will be Mary in the center of it, right? She is the bush that is not consumed. even though she has Christ inside of her, she has God inside of her, she's not consumed by it, and the flames are Jesus. And so always a neat icon when you see it. Here's Moses. He's, I'm here, Lord, I'm here, Lord. And the Lord says to him, tell Pharaoh to let my people go. I want you to go back to Egypt. I want you to help free them. And Moses says, well, but they won't listen to me. I mean, I can't even tell them, you know, well, who am I supposed to say called me? Who am I supposed to say told me to do this? And God reveals his name. I am who I am, right? He is not a local deity. He tells Moses, I am eternally. I hold all things in existence. It's this tremendously mysterious name that separates him from all the gods of the pagans. I'm not an alligator. I'm not thunder. I'm not lightning. I'm not the sun. I simply am what I am, who I am. And God tells Moses to go tell Pharaoh that the Israelites need 3 days in the wilderness to sacrifice to their one God. And by the way, have the women, the Israelite women, ask their Egyptian neighbors for gold and silver jewelry and for clothing. You know, so Moses in his head, he's figuring out that this may be more than 3 days in the wilderness. That's for sure. A little bit more on God's name, Yahweh, just because it is such an important thing. You see right now on your screen a bunch of capital lettered consonants that are all together. And any of you who took typing class would be able to tell me immediately what this said. Even though it has no vowels in it, you would know it says, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy sleeping dog. Well, that's how Hebrew is written. When the original manuscripts, Hebrew doesn't have any vowels in their alphabet. They have only consonants. And God's name is written as YHWH. And if you might see this sometime if you're reading in the footnotes of the Bible, it's called the Tetragrammaton. It's the proper name of God. It comes from this base HWH that means to be. And when you slap a Y out in front of it, the translators don't really know how to translate that. It's I am who I am, or I am what I am, or I will be what I will be, or I am the one who exists. He who causes to be. In different translations of the Bible, you will see these 4 letters, God's proper name, translated in these different ways. About 200 years before Jesus was born, the Jewish priests and rabbis decided that nobody should be saying God's proper name anymore. There are other names that you can call him that are not his proper name. And one of those is Adonai. And it's another Hebrew word. It means my Lord. And I'm sure that they did this for the same reason we probably, you know, there is a commandment that says, do not take the Lord thy God's name in vain. But how many times have you heard people use God with other words that are definitely taking his name in vain? And in order to stop that, the priest said, no more, you're just not going to speak his name. Even when you get up to read in the synagogue, you will substitute the word Adonai, my Lord, instead of saying his proper name, Yahweh. Well, that all worked very fine right up until the time that now we're going to look out at about 600 or 500 to 900 AD, after Christ has risen again, right? And now we're out here in the 600s of our own AD time. People have forgotten how to speak biblical Hebrew, and they can't read it anymore. They don't know how to pronounce the names. And these Jewish scholars who still can read it are like, oh my gosh, our people are not even going to be able to read their own Old Testament. So what they do is they start adding vowel symbols to the Hebrew Old Testament. And because nobody is supposed to say Yahweh anyway, they don't put the vowel markers for A and EH on those four letters. And this is what it looks like in Hebrew. You read Hebrew opposite of the way you read English. This would be the Y, this would be the H, this would be the W, this would be the H, right? Because it's in reverse order. And vowel markers are these little dots and dashes that are underneath the letters. So in order to make it so that people would not say Yahweh's name, they don't put the right vowel markers on there. They take the vowel markers for Adonai and they put them on Yahweh to make a nonsense word. Just pretend that I didn't want you to say the word fox, even when you were reading it out loud to your child. And so instead, I put the vowels for goose in the consonants for fox, so that it says Fooxe, F-O-O-X-E, right? A nonsense word. That's what they have made right here, is a nonsense word. It's not the word Yahweh, and it's not the word Adonai. It's a nonsense word. Well, this leads to some confusion because in 1518 AD, just before Martin Luther actually comes on the scene, a Catholic priest substituted the vowels for Adonai into the Latin translation of Yahweh. There is no Y in Latin, and there's I and there's J that is occasionally used. And so he put in J for the Yahweh, and then he put in the vowels for Adonai. And what he came up with was Jehovah, which when it was translated into English became Jehovah, which is a nonsense word, but it made its way into the first translation of the King James Version of the Bible. And so people will go around saying Jehovah as though it were actually written into the Old Testament. And it must just cause Jewish people to cringe when they hear that, because they recognize what has happened, right? Somebody got a hold of it who didn't know their culture, their tradition, and made up a word that for God that was never in the Old Testament. And then somebody picked it up for their religion, Jehovah's Witnesses, right? I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing on God's name, Jehovah or Yahweh. So back to Exodus 4. Moses has been commanded to go back to Egypt, but he doesn't really want to go back. God has, he gives him a rod because Moses is saying, and he's right, these people are not going to believe me. Well, Moses says, throw your rod on the ground. It'll turn into a snake, right? But you can pick it up by its tail and it'll turn back into a rod. And by the way, take your hand and put it inside your tunic. And he takes it back out and it's a leprous hand. It's all white. And then he puts it back in and it comes back and it's a normal hand again. And last but not least, right, Moses is arguing with God. He's saying, I am a man of uncircumcised lips, i.e., I don't speak well. I just am not a good speaker. Don't send me. And so God says, oh, I'm going to be with you. I've given you this snake rod. I've given you your leper hand. I'll be right there with you. Moses is like, oh, I can't do it. I can't speak well. He says, God gets mad. He's like, well, your brother Aaron can speak, right? You will be God to Aaron. I will speak to you. You will speak to Aaron, and Aaron will talk to the people. And so Moses, Moses is kind of forced to take that position. And but then there's an interesting little line where God says, you know, I'm going to send you in here. You're going to have these different miracles that are going to be worked with your help. However, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And so he won't respond. Well, you have to remember we said when you read the Bible, you have to know the culture of the time. Well, the culture of that time, right? They have dealt only with pagan gods, and they need to have an expression for God that may, you know, he's all powerful. He is in control of everything. And so they say God is going to harden Pharaoh's heart, much, but it's just their culture. It's like in our culture right now, we might write thanks a million. Do we really intend to go back and say thank you a million times over? No, we don't, right? That's just a way of expressing ourselves. God doesn't harden hearts, but he does know when our hearts will be hardened to his grace. He's constantly calling us. He's constantly trying to bring us back to him. And I can think of a million times in my life when I've known the direction God has wanted me to go, but it's not the direction I want to go. And so I ignore him. I screen him out of my life. I try to do it less now, but it still happens. And so God hardening Pharaoh's heart is really say a way of saying Pharaoh's heart is hard and he is not willing to allow God's grace to change it. And God knows that. You also have kind of a weird passage in there. It's a symbolic circumcision of Moses, right? Moses starts on his way back to Egypt, and he's got Zipporah with him, and he's got his sons, and he's got, remember, Moses is raised by Egyptians, so Moses himself would not be circumcised. That's something that happens when a baby is 8 days old. He probably would not even have known about circumcising his own children. And God, again, the culture describes this as God is angry with Moses, right? Now you've got that tradition of the priestly people, the priestly tradition that is also explaining what are the rules that go with being an Israelite. And one of them is circumcision. Moses is not circumcised. So in this little passage, Zipporah takes her infant son, she circumcises, then she takes that foreskin from the baby and she places it on the feet of Moses. Well, oftentimes in the Old Testament, when it mentions somebody's feet, what they're really talking about are genitals. So she probably placed it on Moses' genitals as sort of a symbolic circumcision of Moses, which appeases God, which is basically the priestly generation saying, see, even Moses had to be circumcised. So Moses continues on with his family towards Egypt, and God sends Aaron out to, oops. I just got to make sure there's nobody else looking in here. Nope, I don't think so. So Aaron comes out through the wilderness. God has told him to go meet your brother Moses, who he wouldn't have hardly known at all, but he does it. And Moses tells him what God has told him. They tell the elders of Israel, and God's people believe what Moses is saying and what Aaron are saying to them, and they worship the one God. And I love this statue of Moses that's in the Library of Congress. We probably have to look at it quick. I'm sure they'll take it out soon for some reason. But a mighty man was he. So Moses and Aaron are now ready to approach Pharaoh. And Moses goes to Pharaoh in chapter 5 and 6, and he says, Pharaoh, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, he has said, let my people go. And Pharaoh responds, you know, your people have too much time on their hands. If they're worried about going out into the wilderness to go worship this God, they got way too much time on their hands. I know a way to get rid of that time. Let's have them make their bricks without giving them any straw. They have to go out and get the straw themselves. Well, that's a huge effort. And it takes a job that's already very difficult and makes it that much more difficult. And they're not allowed to make any fewer bricks, even though they've got another major job on their shoulders. Well, the people cry out, right? They're mad at Moses. They're mad at Aaron. They've been drawn into this thing where all they've done is irritated their master. And now their lives are even worse than before. And Moses goes to God. He says, I told you I'm a man of uncircumcised lips. I'm not a good speaker. I couldn't convince Pharaoh. Everything is worse. Why did you tell me to do this? And God reassures him. He says, I have a plan, right? God writes with crooked lines. God knows what the plan is. We just don't know exactly how he's going to get there. And a lot of times we think he's going the wrong direction, just like Moses did. But God reassures him. And he says, you know, you even know my name. Your fathers, they did not. Abraham, he didn't know my name. None of them knew my name. You know my name. I'm right here with you. We're going to do this. And then you get the genealogy of Moses and Aaron. Again, a very, very important thing, because the Levites are going to be the priestly class. And so you want to see who are these people who are in line to be priests within Israel. And as we go through the Old Testament, you'll see a lot of these names pop up again in our reading. So it's kind of an interesting genealogy. So in Exodus chapter 7, Moses is ready to go back and try it again. And so Moses tells Aaron, you know, he tells Pharaoh, let my people go. That's what our God wants. Let us go and worship him in the wilderness for 3 days. And Pharaoh's not impressed. And so Aaron throws his rod down on the ground and it becomes a snake. But the Egyptian magicians that you see all looking on here, they do the same thing. They just take their rods, they throw them on the ground, they turn into snakes. But then Aaron's rod eats the rest of the magician snakes. But Pharaoh's heart is hard, right? He's probably thinking to himself, oh, if they had a little bit of practice, their snakes would be bigger. He's not budging. So then God works his first plague on the land. He tells Aaron to use his rod to turn all the water in Egypt into blood. And everything turns into blood, all the waters do. But the magicians are able to go, and it tells us at the very end of Exodus 7 that the people of Egypt dug around their normal wells so that they could get water that was still clean. And the magicians must have gone out, gotten some clean water, and showed Pharaoh, look, we can do that too, right? We can change water into blood. And so in Exodus chapters 8 through 11, he's not budging. So God has 9 more plagues that are worked. There's the plague of frogs, the plague of gnats, flies, death of Egypt's livestock. There's boils, there's thunder and hail, there's locusts, darkness, and then finally, the death of Egyptians firstborn, of all of Egypt's firstborn, both man and beast. Finally, he gets some attention, right? Now, 7 of those miracles are produced with the help of Moses and Aaron, or Moses alone. 3 of them are done by God alone. God doesn't ask for any help from Moses and Aaron for the flies, or for the death of Egypt's livestock, or for the death of Egyptians firstborn, right? And that's an important thing about God. God doesn't need any of us. He didn't need Moses and Aaron. He could have found another way, but he allows us to participate. It's part of his love for us. Just like, there's nothing that your children or grandchildren like better than helping you do something. My nieces, they love to help their grandmother cook, especially if they're cooking cakes or brownies or stuff. That's their favorite. But they love helping. And God allows us to help. He allows us to participate, but he doesn't need us. The Egyptian magicians, they could only reproduce the blood in the frogs, right? But magic is one of those things that the Bible warns us again and again to stay away from. Usually when we see black magic, Satan is a very powerful angel, and Satan can help people do magic. And it's one of the reasons that we're warned again and again to stay away from tea leaf readers, from soothsayers, because if it's not God who's doing it, then it's some other force that's doing it. It is one of my favorite priests used to always say, there are lots of angels on this earth, and not all of them are good. Starting with the frogs, Pharaoh makes promises of release, but then he reneges. And he starts out with little promises like, oh, I'll let you go out in the wilderness. And then, but don't go far. And then I'll let all the men go out, but you're going to leave your cattle and your women here. And little by little, he starts making bigger and bigger promises. But every single time he reneges until he loses his firstborn son. And then he responds to God, right? And I've seen it in my own life. I told you in that first class, for a long time, I was an atheist and an agnostic, and I had really no belief in God at all. And it was only when life flattened me, it was only when I had no hope left at all, that I was willing to accept the grace that God was offering me and to recognize that there was a loving God that existed. And I can see, when I read this story, I think of that when I see Pharaoh, that his heart was hard until he lost that son that he loved. And then he starts thinking, maybe I really better let God's people go. In these plagues, God sometimes uses natural events, or could have used natural events, right? Any of you who've been around places that have had way too much moisture know that you can get tons of frogs. I know in Nebraska, when we got a huge flood on the Missouri River, we had biting gnats that came so bad that I actually bought a hat that had net around the face, because you were breathing gnats in. Flies, we're all experiencing that right now, right? Boils, those are a natural thing. Death of Egypt's livestock, there are all sorts of different diseases. Thunder and hail, yes. Locusts, yes. 3 days of darkness, not so much. Death of Egyptians firstborn, not possible that would not be something outside of nature. Even the things that were within nature, God did the timing of them, right? He needed these things to come quickly in a row so that Pharaoh would finally let Israel go. And it was something else to remember is in part of even these natural events, was that Israel in the Goshen Valley was being spared from the plagues, which is not natural. That is, again, a miracle. So some wisdom that gives us insight into God's motives. Why did God do so many plagues? Why didn't he just like do the firstborn right from the get-go, right? God knows everything. He knew when the Egyptian Pharaoh would finally soften and let his people go. But you have to remember that God is like a parent. He's always teaching, and he had something to teach the Egyptians. And he's also a just God, right? He he is both merciful and just. And if you go to the book of wisdom, which I think in your Bibles, I didn't put mine next to me, but I think it's on page 888. In there it says, uh, chapter 11, verses 6 and 7, instead of the fountain of an ever-flowing river, stirred up and defiled with blood and rebuke for the decree to slay the infants, right? Back in that book of wisdom, it's referring to what happened in Egypt, right? They were saying to throw the Israeli male infants into the water, and God defiled their river and is in an act of justice. And later in wisdom, in verses 15 and 16, it says, in return for their foolish and wicked thoughts, which led them astray to worship irrational serpents and worthless animals, you sent upon them a multitude of irrational creatures to punish them, that they might learn that one is punished by the very things which he sins, right? They needed to watch the Jewish people. They needed to see the one God. Instead, they started worshiping irrational serpents and animals. And so God turns those very irrational things back on them to teach them that you don't worship those things. In our society today, you can look at the things that, that sometimes we worship. We worship basketball players, football players, golfers. We worship big houses, right? And God has a way, even in our own lives, of taking those things that we are sinning by wanting them more than wanting God, and turning them around so that we realize we need God once again. The conclusion of all of these different plagues that God sends, his message to Egypt is that God is more powerful than the Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt. Many of those different animals in there, especially like bulls and frogs, the Egyptians worshiped the river goddess, and the river goddess had as her servants frogs, right? The Egyptians had a very intricate and messed up religious system, and the one God, the God of the chosen people, is showing them who really is in charge. Finally, we get to Exodus 12, chapter 12, and the institution of the Passover, right? This is how the Israelites are going to avoid the destroyer. God has said to Moses, I'm going to kill the firstborn of all the Egyptians, both their beasts and the Egyptians themselves. And he says, but you know, this time it's different, right? Before, the Israelites didn't have to do anything not to get thunder and hailed on. They didn't have to take any action. But now God is telling them to take an action. He says, this is what you're to do. On the night before I'm going to pass through all of Egypt and take the firstborn, you, each of your households, get together and sacrifice an unblemished lamb, being careful not to break any bones. And if your family's too small, you can get with another family, right? But this is really a family thing. You're each going to take a lamb. You're not going to break any of its bones. You're going to bleed it out, because they were never allowed to eat the blood of animals. The blood belonged to God. It was its life fluid. but they're going to drain the blood out, and God tells them to take hyssop, which is like just a plant, and dip it into the blood, and then they're going to take that hyssop and they're going to mark the lintel of their door and their doorpost. So they're going to do it on the vertical run of the doorpost, and then they're going to go across the crossbeam, and they're going to put lamb's blood on it. And then they're going to take the rest of the lamb, they're going to roast it, and he's very exact. You're going to roast it, don't boil it, don't do anything else. You roast it, eat it, and burn what remains in the morning. There is to be nothing left. He says, eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, with loins girded, sandal on your feet, staff in hand, in haste. Right? Something huge is about to happen. And then we're going to read about, in that chapter, kind of in between this and when the actual event occurs, we're going to have the priestly class come in and tell us how the Passover is going to be instituted for the rest of time for the Jewish culture. And they're going to tell us that there's going to be a 7-day feast of unleavened bread. And the first night of that is going to be the celebration of the Passover. And then the celebration continues. It's such a holy time that you just don't use one day. You take 7 days to remember what God did for Israel. And in the New Testament, when we go to study it, we're going to see that Christ, right before his passion starts, right before he goes out to the Garden of Gethsemane and everything starts going wrong, he sends Peter and John out to prepare the Passover meal. And that's the same Passover meal that Christ would have been taught by Joseph and by Mary and by the rest of his culture about this time when Israel escaped from Egypt because of God's help. Now, the Feast of Passover is still celebrated by Jews around the world. And this is a table that is set for the Passover Seder, the Passover meal. You can see over here this square bread, that's unleavened bread. There are all sorts of restrictions about how that bread is made to make sure that there is no leavening in it at all. It's only flour and water. It has to be made within 15 hours of when you add the water, or 15 minutes of when you add the water to the flour, and you roll it out and make it flat. And then you're going to use a rolling pin that has little pointed things on it, so it makes holes in it, because there is to be no leavening of that bread at all. And here's a plate of bitter herbs right in the center. And there will be a lamb on this table, on this platter, when the meal is finally served. The Passover Seder is on the first night. It always starts on the 15th of Nisan. The Jewish day starts at the setting of the sun. And so as soon as the sun sets, the Seder would start on the 5th. The Nisan is the first month on the Jewish calendar. They still go by a calendar by the moon, so it actually changes every year. They're going to serve lamb. They're going to serve matzah bread, which is unleavened bread, bitter herbs, lettuce, chicory, horseradish, dandelion greens, possibly clover, right? Doesn't sound very appetizing, does it? This is the bitterness of slavery, right? The bitter herbs remind you of what it was like to be slaves. And right there in Exodus, in chapter 12, verses 26 and 27, it tells Israel what they are to do. And when your children say to you, "What do you mean by this service?" you shall say, "It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover. For he passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he slew the Egyptians, but spared our houses." And to this day, when they go and eat this meal, they eat it as a family, right? And it tells us right there in Exodus, but it's to be a 7-day feast of unleavened bread from the 15th to the 21st, and that the Holy Assembly is to meet on the 1st and 7th days. And it's to be done in one house, right? It's one family, it's a family event. There are to be no uncircumcised, no foreigners, and no bones are to be broken. And when Christ finally hangs up on that cross, right? All of these times that the Feast of Passover is celebrated, right up till Christ's time, he eats it, he goes out in the Garden of Gethsemane, he ends up crucified. He is the Paschal Lamb. He is the Lamb of God. And you'll remember that when he's on that cross, he's surrounded by 2 thieves, right? And the Passover is just about to start, and they want to take these guys off the crosses, but they're not going to take them off if they're not dead. So the way that they do it is they go to both of the thieves and they break their legs. There's a little stand at the bottom of a cross. If people can't have their legs on it and push up, they very rapidly suffocate. Well, they break the thieves' legs, but they don't have to break Christ's legs because he's already dead, right? And that is God again showing us that here his son is on the cross. He is the Paschal Lamb. He is the one who will finally atone for the sins of mankind. And it's just such a beautiful meal, and it's so beautifully described in Exodus 12. So the result, we're told about this feast that's going to happen all the time, and then we're taken back to the narrative that tells us what happens next. The Pharaoh has lost his son, and all these Egyptians have lost their firstborn. And so there's now an urgent request for Israel to leave Egypt, right? And that urgent request is like, get out now. So they take their bread without having it rise. They take the gold and silver jewelry from the Egyptians. It says they take cattle and sheep, but they have no other provisions. And they head off. They are in the city of Ramesses, and they head to Succoth. And again, if you look on that second map at the end of your Bible, you will see that Succoth is only a very, very small distance from Ramesses. And so when we start reading Exodus chapter 13 and onward, we'll see what happens. But so far, we have seen the institution of the Passover, which when we get to the New Testament is going to hit home again and again and again. Next week's readings, Exodus 13 through 24. Note that I added 4 chapters to what was on your syllabus. It did say 13 through 20, I think, and now I've got it 13 through 24. And that's because it's just a more logical break in the reading. And so that's the lesson for today. And you can let me go down here and stop recording.